right. Hello, badass parents. In this lesson, I just want to talk through a little bit about the developmental needs of teenagers. Right. This is informed from some developmental psychology, literature, etc. But the goal, there's not really an end state to this particular lesson. It's more of just giving you some information to hopefully help inform you about what's quote unquote normal for teenagers. Okay. Um, So here we go. So the biggest thing to recognize it, and we all experienced it when we were teenagers. I certainly would not choose to go back. Teenagers are awkward, right? There's so much stuff that is new and challenging and that they're dealing with. So everything from puberty and clumsiness and pimples and hormones to starting to be interested in romance and sex and your body actually physically growing and developing and your intellect and figuring out where you fit in the social sphere at school and starting high school. And holy moly, man, it creates a perfect storm that often leads teens to become overwhelmed and at one time or another ride various emotional highs and lows. So as best you can as a parent, having some empathy and remembering what it was like for you as a teen. I know we've all been out of that for a while now, and it's hard to remember sometimes how difficult this stage of life really is. But doing our best to retain some empathy that it's a hot mess, right? Your teenage years are a hot mess. So if we can bring some of that empathy and we can help hopefully parent in a way that is going to be a little kinder, if you will, to their ups and downs and dilemmas of life. Okay. So from a developmental perspective, there are two basic drives that really set the teenage years apart from earlier childhood. And what those two drives are is that they are very much trying to discover their identity, right? Who am I? And they are absolutely trying to establish their independence from you as parents, right? They are trying to become an individual separate from you. Now, there's a lot that turns into behaviorally, but those are the fundamental drives of what teenagers developmentally are trying to do in any given moment. And in that discovering their identity, this is a time where they're doing a lot of exploration. They're often joining teams, engaging in school politics or student government, getting involved in clubs or other activities. They are also beginning to be very much more concerned about how others perceive them, where they fit in the social order, if you will. And questions about who they are and what they stand for constantly kind of buzzing in their head do tend to create a lot of anxiety and uncertainty for teenagers. So that discovering their identity is a very they're starting that process. As we know, this is often a lifelong process for many of us. We're still trying to figure out what we want to be when we grow up, and that's okay. But the actual process is for the first time because they're intellectually able to handle these kinds of forward thinking. They are starting this process now at the teenage years. The other thing they're doing at the same time is trying to figure out who they are. Is they're trying to again establish and pursue independence. And because of this, they start to pull away from parents and start relying more on friendships, romances, and relationships with teachers or coaches for the emotional support that they would have typically come to you for in earlier stages when they're, middle school to elementary school years. Which obviously can be pretty tough on parents because they are now starting to be significantly less receptive to your advice and your guidance. Maybe they don't want to listen to you. I can't tell you how many parents I've talked with. They're like, man, if they just hear it from somebody other than me, they'll listen. So simply from the fact that you're their parent, even though you're saying the exact same thing that I might be saying in this program, because it's coming from me who's not their parent, suddenly it's, wisdom. So acknowledging that's normal. We all did it as teenagers. We all thought our parents were the dumbest people ever when we were teenagers, right? Until we got into young adulthood, we're like, wow, they knew a lot and we now go back and talk to them about things. Your kids aren't there yet, right? They haven't gotten to that reflective phase. They don't see you as an entity of wisdom and knowledge. You are their parent who is getting in their business, and it is what it is. So while it may, another concern that comes up during this time is while they may make it appear that they don't need you anymore, that's just absolutely false. They absolutely still need you. They're just going to need you in different ways than maybe they did up through their younger elementary, middle school years. Okay, so they still need you. They're just going to need you in different ways, which again can be hard as a parent, depending on your what you loved about that when they came to you. So now, how does these two things play out in sport? What that means is you should start to see some increases in, for instance, sporting intelligence. Because their cognitive abilities are getting to more mimic adulthood, they're able to understand field play, games, strategy, coaching instructions, right? They can understand the why behind things. And they're also better able to understand second and third order effects. So if I make this decision, here's what will happen next, type of thing. So that's starting to improve. The other thing is they start to become interested in leadership. There are some kids that have been doing that since they were little, and that's just kind of innate to who they are. For whatever reason, they just have that ability. But leadership is in fact a skill and can be developed. And if it's something that they're passionate about, or your teenagers are more likely to start experimenting with that, or putting themselves in situations where they might be willing to lead, whether that's vocally, being a team captain or something like that, or whether it's just leading by example and doing the right thing even though nobody's looking, kind of situation. They're also starting to discover the mental side of the sport, things like concentration, dealing with pressure, and confidence. So these will start to become more relevant to their performance. Obviously, skill acquisition is still important. They're still developing their physical skill sets, but they'll start to recognize the mental side of the sport more and more. So it is important to know, however, that even as they approach their senior year, their brains may not be fully developed yet. So our frontal lobes, the part that's in charge of executive functioning, decision-making, critical thinking, for many people, that part of your brain does not stop developing until till young adulthood, early 20s. So even though your kid, your 18-year-old might legally be an adult, that does not mean that they have the frontal lobe capacity to make decisions and think through things the same way adult would. So just knowing that every kid is different, and some of them are absolutely fully going to have that potential by the time they leave high school. Couple people, not so much, right? We don't know that unless you're going to go get some like fMRI scans or something of your kid. You just won't know that, which can make it difficult to accurately assess their abilities and their need for guidance. So just being aware that that's at play, and you got to gauge that as best you can. So often, even though kids are starting to mimic the intellectual capabilities of adults, they're getting there, right? They're developing that ability. They are significantly more emotionally fragile at this point. Sometimes you have probably been surprised by how ill-equipped they are to handle some seemingly manageable setbacks in life. Have you ever seen your child just break down in tears because of a certain loss, or they made a mistake and you asked about it later and they just broke down? This emotional volatility is developmentally appropriate, right? With their intellectual capacity, their emotional intelligence has not yet caught up with their cognitive intelligence. And so just being aware of that, they're still going to have a lot of emotional needs, and they're going to need a lot of coaching as it relates to managing their emotions and their experiences there. So some core traits that, if we're looking from the years 13 to 18, obviously it can be tough to know what's quote unquote normal and healthy, but in the context of sport, Here are some basic things that should be happening and should be starting to develop in your child, in your kid, as they're in those high school years. Again, we're going to focus on the areas of confidence, interests, relationships, judgment, emotional control, and sport related skill sets. So confidence wise, generally speaking, your kid, this is a time, this age, 13 to 18, is a time where they should start to be discovering their strengths and their weaknesses. They have to learn to manage their negative feelings, and especially when setbacks occur around their weaknesses. They're going to discover that there's certain things they're not good at. And they need to know that. That's an important part of development and growth. And so what that means for you as a parent, which can be very difficult, is that they need to be given the opportunity to fail. They need to be given the opportunity to fall on their face and learn what their weaknesses are, so that they can improve and get better prepared for the next opportunity. Without the failure moment, they are not getting an accurate gauge of their capabilities. And that's going to make them less functional in the adult world. So this building learning process will help them build competence, which is what's going to help them to feel confident. And when they feel like they have the ability, and they believe that they have the ability, that's where confidence comes from. So we need to give them failure opportunities to build their competence. Okay. Instead of protecting them from failure, instead of putting them in a bubble, they need to be given the opportunity to mess up. Okay. From an interests perspective, in the teen years, this is a time of exploration and change. You might realize that your kid has probably they have so many interests. They're like, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this. And obviously as a parent, that's tough. Money's tight, or that you just don't have hours in the day to let them do all these things. So navigating that conversation with your teenagers about, hey, you got to pick something. But anyway, this idea of helping whatever they've come to, whatever decisions you've come to as a family, helping them manage their time is an important process as a parent. At this point, it was where they really need some guidance, because navigating these multiple interests and making sure that they are actually spending time on relationships, on their sport, in academics, in the hobbies that they have, will help them develop into well-rounded individuals and to create an identity that is not solely dependent on their sport to define them. And that's really important, because we see in older years, for instance, if your identity is so wrapped up in one thing and that thing is taken away from you. For instance, I see this I saw this in college quite a bit, college students who had a season-ending injury or a career-ending injury. They were no longer to continue playing because their identity was so wrapped up in being that sport athlete. They broke down. They were depressed. They had a lot of issues. So it's important to instill now in these years the value of being well-rounded. Absolutely, it's okay and good to excel in one particular identity, but to recognize that that is not all defining, and that balance is important for overall health, resilience, and thriving in life. So helping to instill that as your kid pursues various interests that they have, you should support that, because they need to be well-rounded. Relational wise, your teens are going to start directing much of their energy, time and energy, away from parents and towards their peers. And the good news is that athletics can be a particularly strong opportunity for them to build strong friendships, and to get that adult guidance from a figure that's not you. So their relationships with coaches are going to become play a more critical role as they advance from 13 to 18. And so making sure as a parent, you're surrounding them with some good coaches, some folks that you trust to give good, effective guidance as your teens establish their identity. I know for me, this was valuable when I was in high school. My high school college coach, my high school coach, Raf, was an amazing human being. And I know that there were things that I just wasn't comfortable talking with my parents about sport and because of various reasons. Not because I didn't value my parents' opinion. It just, I needed to talk to somebody who wasn't my parents. And he had this green chair in his office. Happened to be the athletic director at our high school as well. And we just come and sit in the chair, and he just, would provide that perspective and the coaching and that mentorship. So that's normal and that's good. Your kids should be seeking out guidance from other adults. So doing your best to surround them with quality adults, people's whose opinions and guidance you can trust. And it's a good sign for your adolescents. It's a good sign if your adolescents are using sports and other areas of interest to experiment with developing strong relationships with coaches, teachers, and peers, to include romantic interests. And the reasons that's important is because these are lessons that they need for adulting, right? They got to learn in these safe areas where they still have parental support, how to navigate some of the realities of life. Because when you release them to their own, the post high school years, they're going to have to do a lot of that by themselves. So helping them grow that capacity now is important. Now, judgment, I've talked a lot about this. At this point, teens should, as they get towards 18, should definitely develop the capacity to evaluate, judge, and critique their own behavior. This process does produce a lot of fear and anxiety for you often as a parent, because you want to protect your kid. You absolutely want what's best for them. And that is wonderful. That's a good thing. Okay. But it's precisely that freedom to make mistakes that they need to develop as a human being. And if you are protecting them from those moments, you're depriving them of really important learning lessons that they need to become more functional as an adult. So as a rule of thumb, the key is to reward teens with more freedom and independence as they demonstrate the capacity to learn from their mistakes and act responsibly. Right. So trust, but verify, right? You got to give them opportunities to spread their wings, to try to make decisions, but they will absolutely still need your support and guidance. However, by 18, they should certainly have the ability to evaluate their decisions and behaviors and understand the consequences of their actions. Okay. Emotional control. This is something, obviously, we're all still developing. Should get easier with maturity and adulthood. However, it's not always the case. So your teens, from the emotional control perspective, they have become more sophisticated intellectually, but oftentimes that emotional intelligence has not caught up with their intellect. So frequently they do not understand why they feel the way they do. And so through your guidance and parenting, and hopefully this course and the tools that I'm teaching them will help them learn specific strategies to get a better handle on that emotional regulation. But this is probably the biggest difference between a teen and an adult, is this emotional regulation piece. They are going to struggle, and that's developmentally appropriate. This is where they're starting to figure things out. So hopefully by the end of their teen years, as they're leaving kind of high school, that you've seen growth in this ability for them to manage their emotions, to handle overwhelming emotions, and to recover more quickly and use their own resources to do it. Okay, so that's what you should be striving for here as you parent them. Okay. And then from a sports related skills perspective, they should start developing the composite of mental and physical abilities, and that will shape their athletic identity. So who they are as a player, you might start to see that solidify at this point. And you have to realize that talent and maturity emerge at uniquely different moments for every kid. Some kids are going to be physically gifted earlier, but they don't have the mental and emotional capacity to really handle game situations, for instance. So that's unfortunately going to happen differently for each kid. But ideally, by the age of 18, they're starting to reach most of their growing, like literally physically. They're the size they're going to mostly be. We know for boys, that's a little bit different. For most girls, they're usually done growing by 18. That's not hard, fast rule, but for most of them. So what that means is that they've hopefully started to grow into their body. And so their eye-hand coordination should be better. They have an advanced ability to understand the more tactical, complex aspects of their sport, as well as develop their confidence in those areas. Okay. So from a developmental perspective, this is kind of what you should be looking for in these teen years in each one of these areas. Now, the guidance you give, the parenting you give, pacing matters. And you are the best judge as to whether your kid has the physical and emotional stability to handle more intense or competitive environments. General rule of thumb is a slow pace is a far less risk, has a far less risk of pushing your kid or athlete too hard. But opening up that dialogue, being open with, if you're, for instance, your kid is, in your estimation, probably should stay on the JV team, but they want to try out and they want to be a part of the varsity team, having that conversation. Hey, here's why I think JV might be a good fit for you. However, please go try out. I mean, do what you can and we'll see how it goes. I just think it would benefit you, and here's why, blah, 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 right? Inserting whatever's true for your kid. So generally speaking, not pushing too hard is important because we don't want kids to experience burnout or just start hating the game. That's never a good thing. However, also understanding that our perceptions of our kids' abilities are not always accurate, and we have to acknowledge that. And that could be on either end of the spectrum. So of course, for most parents, you think your kid is pretty exceptional, which is good, right? Your kids need to know that you believe in them and you value their skill sets, right? That you think they're good. And that does help build their self-worth. However, if you are more prone to overestimating the level of your child's ability and maturity, this can put a lot of pressure on your young teen who is basically facing situations that they're not ready for. And with your expectations feeling like they should be ready, it can create a lot of pressure and a lot of performance anxiety in different situations that are just not going to be great for them. So doing your best to see your kid for who they are, not who you want them to be. I highly recommend trusting the coach's opinions. They often, especially at the elite travel level, you have these coaches are often not parents of the kid. So they're a little more unbiased. They also, if they've been coaching for a long time, they have years and years of data of other kids to compare your kid to. So often they are a more accurate assessor of your child's actual athletic ability. So trusting that source. Obviously, not every coach is the same, but using some sort of outside entity to help you get an accurate assessment of your child's ability would be important. So I want to leave you with one additional comment based on some recent research that's coming out that might be affecting your child's development. So there's a particular book, I'll post it down. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting a Generation Up for Failure. Now, there's a lot in here and I'm not going to read it, but there's a particular area that's influencing our kids' development that I just want to read a paragraph to you for your awareness. This particular research was done in relation to why college behavioral health, mental health services are being overrun. And so as they were researching, here's what they discovered. The first is that kids now grow up much more slowly than previous generations. Activities that are commonly thought to mark transition from childhood to adulthood are happening far later. For example, having a job, driving a car, drinking alcohol, going out on dates, having sex. Members of the current generation wait longer to do these things and do less of them than did members of previous generations. Instead of engaging in these activities, which usually involves interacting with people face to face, teens today are spending much more time alone interacting with screens. Of special importance, the combination of helicopter parenting, fears for children's safety, and the allure of screens means that members of the current generation spend less time than previous generations did going out with friends while unsupervised by an adult. The bottom line is that the researcher is because of this lack of offline experiences, 18-year-olds now act like 15-year-olds used to. 13-year-olds now act like 10-year-olds used to. Teens are physically safer than ever, yet they are more mentally vulnerable. Most of the trends are showing up across social classes, races, and ethnicities. So members of the current generation, therefore, may not, on average, be as ready for college as were 18-year-olds of previous generations. Okay. So I just put that out there for your awareness. Our current reality with technology is influencing our kids' development. It's not necessarily good or bad, right or wrong, but it is. And so factoring that into your decisions as a parent, how can you really help your kid develop the mental and emotional capacities that they need to be a successful adult? And how can you let sports be the vehicle for that growth? Okay, so below there's a document for tips on how to navigate the teen sport experience. Look through those, take them at face value. Again, they come from developmental psychology resources. But hopefully now you have a pretty decent idea of where your kids should be in these years of 13 to 18.